In 1945 alone, the United States military handled nearly 3 billion pieces of mail. Not orders, not intelligence reports, not logistics manifests. Letters. Handwritten, love-struck, homesick letters scratched out by candlelight in foxholes and aboard destroyers and in half-destroyed farmhouses on the road to Berlin. 3 billion of them in a single year. The generals had not planned for this. When America mobilized 16 million men and women after Pearl Harbor, the brass issued manuals on everything from camouflage discipline to field sanitation. What they had not anticipated was the sheer, unstoppable scale of human longing. They had not anticipated that the average American soldier, separated from everyone he loved by an ocean and a war, would sit down and write 6 letters every single week. And that the people he had left behind, the wives, the sweethearts, the mothers writing at kitchen tables while the radio played, would write back just as faithfully. What the Army discovered, almost by accident, was that love is not a distraction from war. It is one of the primary reasons men fight. Mail call was the proof. In units across every theater, the distribution of letters had to be tightly managed, because the men who received no mail were the men who came apart. Officers reported it openly in their after-action assessments. The U.S. military formally classified correspondence from home as the single greatest morale booster available to troops in combat, ranked above additional food, above rest, above nearly every other intervention the Army could provide. A man who had a letter from his wife read differently than one who did not. He held the line differently. The Army had stumbled onto a strategic asset it had never trained for, and its name was ordinary human love. The problem was logistics. By 1942, the volume of personal mail crossing the Atlantic and Pacific had become genuinely alarming. A single shipment of 150,000 one-page letters required 37 mail sacks and weighed roughly 2,575 pounds. On a cargo vessel already groaning with ammunition, fuel, and food, that weight had consequences. Every mail sack displaced critical war materiel. The Post Office Department, the War Department, and the Navy Department gathered to solve what was, technically, a supply chain crisis caused by too many people trying too hard to stay in love. The solution was V-Mail, Victory Mail. Launched on June 15, 1942, and modeled on a British system called the airgraph, V-Mail was one of the more quietly remarkable pieces of engineering the Allied war effort produced. A soldier or his sweetheart wrote their letter on a standardized single-page form. That form was then photographed, using specially designed Kodak cameras, onto 16mm microfilm. The rolls were shipped across the ocean at a fraction of the weight and space of paper. At the destination, each frame was enlarged, printed at about half the original size, and delivered to the recipient. Those 37 mail sacks of 150,000 letters. Under V-Mail, they fit into one. The weight dropped from 2,575 pounds to 45. In the first 2 years of the program alone, V-Mail was estimated to have saved 5 million pounds of cargo space, tonnage that instead carried bombs and blood plasma and boots. Between June 1942 and November 1945, over 1 billion V-Mail items were processed. 1 billion photographs of love letters, longing compressed onto microfilm and shuttled across war zones, so that a woman in Ohio could read a note from her husband somewhere he was not allowed to name. The system also served, quietly, as a security measure, because invisible ink and microdots are useless on a photographic copy. The censors found V-Mail harder to compromise than conventional post. Love letters turned out to be remarkably difficult to weaponize. Every letter, of course, went through censorship first. Soldiers could not reveal their location, their unit strength, their operational plans, or anything that might prove useful to an enemy who intercepted the mail. In some cases, the censor's scissors removed more than half a letter's text, leaving the recipient with a page of neat rectangular holes and the baffling task of reading around absences. Wives and mothers across America became expert readers of what was not there, of the shape of what had been cut away. What the soldiers were left with was what mattered most anyway, the small, precise details of a life they were trying to hold on to from 10,000 miles away. They wrote about the food, which was usually terrible. They wrote about card games and about the men in their unit who made them laugh. They wrote about the rain, which was a thing a censor could not classify. They wrote about the exact, specific way they planned to sit at a particular table and eat a particular meal when they got home. What they could not write directly, they wrote around. The censors cut out the names of places, and the men found ways to tell the people they loved where they were anyway, through the kind of private code that only two people who know each other completely can use. Sometimes a wife received a letter and understood immediately from a single careful phrase that her husband was somewhere she had been praying he would not be. She folded the letter, put it away, and went back to work. That was also a form of valor, and it was almost entirely invisible. The letters they sent back were freer, fewer military secrets in a housewife's account of the garden and the ration books. Women wrote about the factory shifts, about the neighbors, about the children growing up too fast. They wrote about the small shortages, the things that could not be bought, the things that had to be repaired instead of replaced. They wrote about being tired in ways they did not fully explain. And then they wrote something cheerful and sent it anyway. The Postal Museum and the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress have preserved thousands of these exchanges. And what strikes anyone who reads them is not their grandeur but their ordinariness. These were not poets. They were young people who had been separated too early from the people they loved, doing the only thing available to them, which was to keep writing. Not all of them waited. The Army officially discouraged its overseas troops from marrying local women. A GI wanting to wed required his commanding officer's approval, and had to complete as many as 15 separate forms before the military would bless the union. The brass worried about venereal disease, about divided loyalties, about the public relations problem of men abandoning foreign wives after the war. They were also, in many respects, fighting the wrong battle. Love was, as ever, ungovernable. An estimated 1 million women around the world married American servicemen between 1942 and 1952, according to the World War II War Brides Association. They came from Britain, from Australia, from the Philippines, from France, from Italy. They came from Germany, too, though marriages to German women were forbidden until December 1946, as occupation policy slowly shifted. These women had seen the war from the other direction, watched cities fall, watched their families fragment, and then watched young men arrive from across the ocean who seemed, to many of them, almost incomprehensibly well-fed and well-equipped, and crucially, kind. Not all of those relationships were equal, and not all of those marriages held. But they were real, and they happened by the hundreds of thousands, and they left a generation of children who carried two countries inside them. The War Brides Act of December 28, 1945, created a legal path for these women to follow their husbands to the United States. More than 100,000 war spouses and their children ultimately made that crossing. Ships were repurposed, processing camps were organized, medical examinations were conducted on the docks of occupied Europe. Women who had survived bombing campaigns and occupation and years of uncertainty now faced a different kind of uncertainty. America, which they had only known as a rumor, a uniform, a voice in the dark. Most of them stayed. Many of them built remarkable lives. Some of them never stopped being foreign, even after decades. War brides are now one of the most ethnically diverse threads woven into the fabric of the American family, and almost no one remembers them as a category anymore, which is perhaps the truest measure of how thoroughly they arrived. Back home, the waiting had its own weight. In the years of the war, American women had taken factory jobs and managed finances and raised children and made decisions that their husbands would have made, and then written cheerful letters saying everything was fine. The home front had its own exhaustion, its own kind of courage. When the news from a theater went dark, when letters stopped arriving, or when a telegram came instead, the ordinary human infrastructure of a street or a neighborhood absorbed a blow that the histories rarely quantify. Thousands of letters in the archives are marked in red ink: returned, missing in action, whereabouts unknown. A letter that had crossed an ocean to find its man found instead a void. And then the war ended, and 9 months after VJ Day, the maternity wards of the United States ran out of room. Before demobilization, roughly 200,000 Bobbies were born in the United States each month. By the end of 1946, that figure had climbed to nearly 350,000. In the final weeks of 1945 alone, nearly 32 million Bobbies would be born in the 1940s, compared to 24 million in the entire Depression decade before it. Historians have spent decades explaining the baby boom as an economic phenomenon, a product of GI Bill prosperity and post-war optimism. That is true, but it is also, at its most direct, the physical consequence of 16 million reunions. Of people who had written 6 letters a week for 3 years and then, finally, had nothing left to write. The math is simple, the meaning is not. The men and women of the Second World War did not think of themselves as romantic figures. They thought of themselves as ordinary people trying to get through something extraordinary and get home. The 3 billion letters they wrote were not literature. They were maintenance, the daily work of keeping a human connection alive across distances and dangers that would have erased it. What those letters built, across 4 years of war, was the psychological infrastructure of the Allied cause. A man who had something to come home to fought differently. A woman who was writing to her husband every day was sustaining something that the enemy, for all its tanks and doctrine, had no equivalent of. The home front was not separate from the war. It was the reason for it, and it was also, in ways that the official histories rarely capture, a fighting force in its own right. The V-mail microfilm rolls, the censored pages, the 15-form permission slips, all of it was the machinery of a force that no army ever fully accounts for, and no army has ever found a way to defeat. The generals called it morale. The soldiers had a simpler word for it: